Feel free to add your comments throughout the event to the chat box or questions. And also feel free to raise your hand during the question and answer, which hopefully we'll have plenty of time to do. So please introduce yourself and your affiliation before adding your input. All right, so our recording has gotten started. Welcome everybody to today's event on the Global Convention on the Recognition of Qualifications Concerning Higher Education. My name is Will Smith. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Edinburgh and the lead of the Comparative Education International Development Research Group. I'm really excited about today's event, which has been sponsored by the CID Research Group as well as the Higher Education Research Group here at Morehouse School of Education and Sport. So today's panel will have a very basic structure to it. So we're going to hopefully have plenty of time for question and answer. I'll ask each panelist to share for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have hopefully about a half an hour to hear questions, comments, and dig a little deeper into the new convention. Today's panelists, really excited to have both of them join us today. So we have two panelists. So we have Stig Arne Skjerven. So Stig Arne is Norway's special envoy and deputy permanent representative to UNESCO in Paris, a role he has held since 2020. During the last decade, since the idea was put on the table by Norway, Skjerven has contributed to the development of UNESCO's 2019 Global Recognition Convention for Higher Education Qualifications, which finally entered force in March of 2023, so just recently. In his previous role as head of Norway's ENIC NERIC office, he was twice elected as president of the ENIC network. Skjerven is an experienced speaker and contributed in professional media on themes related to mobility and recognition. His background also includes being director of academic affairs at a university college in Norway, and he is a historian by profession. So welcome, Stig Arne. Really excited to have you here today. He'll be joined by Sjur Bergan. So Sjur Bergan was head of the Council of Europe's Education Department until February 1st, 2022. He led the Council of Europe's projects on competencies for democratic culture and the European Qualification Passport for refugees. Sjur represented the Council of Europe and the Bologna follow-up group and board between 2000 and April 2022, and chaired working groups on structural reforms in 2007 to 2015. He remains a member of EHEA working group on the fundamental values of higher education and the group overseeing the roadmap accompanying San Marino's ascension to the EHEA. Sjur was a member of the editorial group for the Council's white paper on intercultural dialogue and a main author of the Lisbon Recognition Convention, as well as the recommendations on the public responsibility for higher education, academic freedom and institutional autonomy, and ensuring quality education. Sjur was series editor of the Council of Europe's Higher Education series, and the author of Qualifications, An Introduction to a Concept, and the book Not a Bread Alone, as well as numerous book chapters and articles on education and higher education policy. Sjur was also one of the editors of the Rave Handbook of Leadership and Governance in Higher Education, and one of the session coordinators at the Bologna Process Researchers Conferences in 2015, 18, and 2020. He's a recipient of the 2019 European Association for International Education Award for Vision and Leadership. And in June 2022, Dublin City University awarded Sjur the degree of Doctor of Philosophy, honoris causa. So I want to thank you both for joining us today. I'm really excited to hear about the new conventions and learn more about global recognition of higher education. So at that point, I want to go ahead and invite Sjur to come in and take control of our slides.
Thank you very much, Will, and thank you very much for the invitation to be with you today. I would like to start by congratulating UNESCO on having developed the Global Convention and now actually having made it a reality. That was not an obvious proposition. It was actually something that UNESCO attempted to do already in the 1990s, and at the time, well, I guess the time is really not ripe, and it did not come off. What did come off, and what will be the focus of my presentation today, is the Lisbon Recognition Convention. And the this is, as many of you will know, actually a joint Council of Europe UNESCO convention, but it does count as a UNESCO regional convention for Europe. What's specific about it is that it's really the first of the new generation conventions. The Council of Europe had, I think, 5 conventions. UNESCO had a Europe Region Convention. The Council of Europe conventions were developed in the 1950s, so they were older than most of the students they were supposed to help. And they were really sort of placed in the mindset of the 1950s and 60s. We didn't talk about recognition, we talked about equivalence. And as we shall see later, that's a quite significant difference. The Council of Europe and UNESCO discussed, and we've decided that we couldn't just sort of amend the old conventions, we needed to write something new. And I think that the Lisbon Recognition Convention, which is open to all countries, both of the European Cultural Convention and of the UNESCO Europe region, has in many ways inspired the other UNESCO regional convention, but also the global convention. And I'm sure that Stig Arne will say more about that. It's a successful convention in the sense that, to my knowledge, there's only one Council of Europe convention that has more ratifications than the Lisbon Recognition Convention. So 56 countries have ratified, 2 quite recently, and 1 more country has signed but not yet ratified, which is the US. And I think the reason is quite simply that it takes a while to get to the top of the agenda of Congress, which would be needed. So it really has set the standard for recognition in Europe. It is the de facto standard, and it also plays a broader role in the European higher education area, because it really is the only binding legal treaty in the European higher education area, which many will know as the Bologna process. The most interesting thing, though, is not its formal function. I think the most interesting thing is, what does it actually say? It introduced a very important concept when it was developed, and in the sense, it changed the assumption. Earlier, you could get your qualification recognized if you could really prove that it was worthy. Now it's up to the competent recognition authorities, so the individual universities, the individual NIC, to assess the qualification, and the basic assumption is that you recognize. The only reason that you could not recognize is that you can demonstrate what is known as a substantial difference. Now, it's difficult, of course, to define in any detail what a substantial difference is, but it really is a difference that would be important in relation to the purpose for which you seek recognition. So if you seek recognition of your qualification because you want to access, say, you have a bachelor's degree and you want to access a master's program, if the institution to which you're applying will say we can't recognize, fine, but then they have to demonstrate why, in terms of the access requirements for their the program for which you seek admission, why they would be justified in not recognizing. And the focus is really very much on the learning outcomes. But I don't think the learning outcomes were quite a concept yet at the time when the Lisbon Recognition Convention was developed 25 years ago. But that's essentially what it's about. It's not about the formal qualifications, the characteristics. It's not about how many years or semester you've studied, but really what you learn during that time. And as we know, the definition of learning outcomes is what you know, what you understand, and what you're able to do with a qualification. I would, for my part, add a 4th dimension, which is the ethical dimension of higher education. That's not only about what you're able to do, but also what you're willing to do. And sometimes that means what you're willing to refrain from doing, even though you may be able to do it. One of the big discussions was whether the Lisbon Recognition Convention should be for academic recognition only, or also for professional recognition. When we talk about professional recognition, it really is recognition for the purpose of accessing a regulated profession. So it is for academic recognition only. Professional recognition is guarded quite jealously by national competences accepted in the EU, where there is an EU directive. But of course, professional recognition is also, at least in large part, based on academic qualifications, and those are recognized under the convention. We looked forward in some respects, not least when it came to realizing that there were some holders of qualifications who, for good reasons, could not document all their qualifications, namely refugees. Now, why was this a topic? Well, in 1997, Europe had a refugee crisis, namely the one from Bosnia and Herzegovina. So the convention does say that parties commit to recognizing qualifications, also when they cannot be fully documented. Then this was left inoperative for some time, and with the Syrian refugee crisis in 2015, we resurrected this provision and developed the European Qualifications Passport for refugees, in which Stig also played a major part. The implementation of the convention is important. A legal text is great, but it's only as good as it's actually the actual act of putting it into practice. So we have a convention committee, and we have the ENIC network, which is a network of national information centers in each country, and they meet annually, exchange quite a lot, and really this is where practice is developed. Revising a convention is, of course, a very tedious story, but we have developed a number of subsidiary texts, such as the criteria and procedures for the recognition of foreign qualification, and some others, also on refugee qualifications. So if you want to summarize, it might be looking interesting.
You have 3 minutes left, so just a reminder.
Thank you. And so if you look at what's in a qualification, well, what if you have a qualification in front of you to ask about? Well, the first question is probably whether it's good enough. So quality is covered in the convention. Now, in 1997, there was still a discussion about whether you needed formal quality assurance or not. 5 years later, that was not a discussion. It was what kind of quality assurance do you need? But the convention says that each state party should be able to provide an overview of the institutional programs that make up its education system. And you cannot do that today without reference to quality assurance. Of course, level, we talk about first degree, we talk about second degree, we talk about third degree, doctoral qualification, we talk about workload, which now it is difficult to do in the European context without reference to the European Credit Transfer and Accumulation System, the ECTS. All of these are covered by the convention, and these three elements really what go into the concept of automatic recognition. In addition to that, we have you would want to know the profile and the learning outcomes of qualification. If you apply for access to a master's program in mathematics, you may have a bachelor's qualification from which is of adequate quality, level, and workload. If it is in history, you're likely to have to do some additional work. So we believe that the developments in Europe, of which the Lisbon Recognition Convention is an important part, has made recognition a lot easier, but there's still need for an assessment and work behind it. And we're delighted to see that many of the elements that we discussed in Europe in 1997, but that we have continued to discuss and refine since then, have now also been taken into account of UNESCO in developing a global convention. I think Stig Arne is much better placed than I am to talk about this. So with this, I'd like to turn over to Stig Arne.
Excellent. Thanks, Sjur, for getting us started, giving us some historical context, and walking us through what a qualification is. So, Stig, I think it's all over to you to tell us about the new global convention.
Thank you very much to colleagues at the University of Edinburgh for inviting me to speak on this event. I mean, the Global Recognition Convention has been very dear to Norway for quite a number of years. The proposal itself was tabled 10 years ago, and it's of course a long process, and it even has like a history before that. I mean, Sjur mentioned that this was already discussed in the 1990s, but it was even up for discussion in the late 40s in the UN in New York, that we should look into the possibility of establishing some sort of global convention for students. And we're actually here today, but it's been a long journey. It takes its steps. And it's also because one has to bring along all member states of an organization. In UNESCO, 193 member states. And it started with a feasibility study. Then it was a drafting committee in which I had the honor to represent. And then the intergovernmental negotiations. Before it, we had a text that was agreed, negotiated, and was decided on in 2019. But it's still just on the road to something, because before a convention enters force, a certain number of countries need to ratify it. In this case, 20 ratifications. And the 20th ratification came in December. It was Andorra and Iceland, two small countries, which was very positive, which ratified. And then 3 months later, in the beginning of March, it entered force, which means that it becomes part of national jurisdiction for those member states which have ratified it. So it becomes international law. Now we're preparing for the first intergovernmental conference. I'll tell a bit about that, but at the same time, on the same decade, there's been a lot of other developments taking place, which is highly relevant as well. It's with other regional conventions, very strongly inspired by the work which Sjur has been very central in the secretariat of the Lisbon Recognition Convention. You have the Tokyo Convention for Asia Pacific, which has entered force. Addis Ababa Convention for the African continent, which has entered force and is existing. The Buenos Aires Convention for Latin America and the Caribbean, which entered force just few months ago, and they had their first intergovernmental meeting. And then it's the Arab Convention, which was negotiated and decided upon last year, which only have one ratification. But it's quite more decisions to be taken, because there is this first COP meeting coming up here in July. The countries which will be sitting around the negotiation table are those member states which have ratified this wonderful convention. Luckily, what we was kind of fearing when we were developing this stage of the convention was that it would be mostly countries in Europe which would quickly go into ratification. Things took longer because of the pandemic, I believe, because student mobility was not particularly high on the agenda in many countries for a couple of years, but now it's coming back up again. But what is very positive is that you have member states from all UNESCO regions. From Africa, you have Cape Verde and Cote d'Ivoire. From Asia Pacific, you have Japan and Australia. From Latin America and Caribbean, you have Cuba and Nicaragua and even Uruguay. And then countries in the Arab world like Tunisia and Palestine, plus some member states that follow then in the footsteps of Norway, which actually was the first country also to ratify this convention. So in July, we're now preparing as the member states that have ratified convention, together with UNESCO, the first decisions, which means the constitution of the convention, the rules of procedure, which regulates how it should be operated, in which I'm sure there are different opinions, and it's going to be difficult, including how many members should there be in the governing body, and should there be with individual capacity, for how long period, and so on. Important things that are in the regulation, and complicated. But more importantly is to decide also on the first work program. I mean, Sjur mentioned here examples from the Lisbon Recognition Convention with subsidiary texts, with agreed upon instruments like the qualification passport, which globally also exists. UNESCO has a qualification passport for refugees and vulnerable migrants, in which also Sjur has been paramount, and Council of Europe, UNHCR, and Norway has been very active in establishing and rolling out. So it's a lot of programmatic issues that needs to be now solved and negotiated. And then, of course, it's elections, which are also important. Who will represent in the first 2 years or 4 years, depending on how this will be set up. And we will know quite a bit more about this in autumn when the decisions have been taken at the meeting. Also for this convention, builds very much on the same concepts as the other regional conventions, which started with the Lisbon Recognition Convention, as it's kind of what we call second generation of conventions. And there is even a definition of substantial difference. And it says that it's significant differences between the foreign qualification and the qualification of the state party, which would most likely prevent the applicant from succeeding in the desired activity. And then it's like given some examples, but it's not an exclusive list on that. Same principles also for recognition that is in the Lisbon Recognition Convention: fair, transparent, and non-discriminatory. That is kind of the practice that follows all the sections that are described. And I'm not going to go into the detail. I mean, the text this is published on UNESCO's webpage, but it's not a copy paste of the regional conventions. There are similarities. Some things are more or less identical, but I would like to highlight a couple of things that is particular with the Global Convention, is that it also includes prior learning. I mean, recognition of prior learning is, however, it's not a shall, like with many other things in the convention. It's a may, which means more opening. It was impossible to get a global consensus that it should be included. But it also have like the special provisions on vulnerable groups, even stronger than in the Lisbon Recognition Convention. And then also another aspect which Sjur didn't touch upon, which I will talk a little bit about, is information provisions, which is the key. Because Norway, UK, China, countries that have ratified this convention eventually, they will have a responsibility not only to recognize according to the principles in the convention, but also make it possible and easy for persons with qualifications from their country, from Norway, to have the qualifications recognized. So that means that I have to have information provisions that are national information systems on qualifications, on qualification framework, if applicable, on quality assurance mechanism, which institutions are and have been part of education system, and so on, to facilitate this. Getting to the last
a reminder,
slide.
You have 3 minutes left, Stig.
What is important with this? It is actually a huge achievement. Not only is it a global convention when it comes to mobility, but this is actually a fantastic opportunity to lift higher education higher on the agenda. Sjur was telling about how the LRC, the Lisbon Recognition Convention, contributed to lifting recognition higher up in the European education area and has stayed important there. This gives also an opportunity to really discuss higher education between the state parties which have ratified the convention. And also, it is a fact that when you actually say, I'm going to ratify this convention, let's say Ireland is going to ratify the convention tomorrow, it means that they have to follow these principles. The same if Guinea wants to ratify this convention, it means that they have a legal obligation to follow the principles. And with this, it actually better facilitates mobility across regions, but also, I believe, inside regions, in particular where regional conventions are quite new. So in that case, it will actually contribute to brain circulation. Because as it is now, countries like my own Norway, the UK, the traditionally like receiving countries in student mobility have good mechanisms to do so. I mean, we want students and we would like them to stay, and we would also like them to possibly to come and be part of our employment in the sense. While I have this story about a girl called Susanna. She came to Norway. She was from Bolivia. She studied at university in the western part of Norway, got a top degree in petroleum technology, went back to her home country, Bolivia. She wanted to start working in the oil industry, which was then being built up in Bolivia as well. But nobody understood the value of her qualification. And there was no mechanism for having those procedures done. Today, she works in Houston in the American oil industry. And there's so many examples of this that really is stopping this brain circulation that we all talk about. But this is actually a tool that can make this more of a reality. I think also it will contribute more to real cooperation in international higher education between regions. And it is also important that this will be a global framework to kind of connect the dots between the regional conventions, which are sophisticated, but documents based on those conventions, like subsidiary texts and referenced tools like the qualification passport and other things, vary quite a lot between regions. So this can kind of try to put things a lot together. So it's a global reference point for supporting best practice and tools. Lastly, what is the global convention not? This is nothing about harmonization on educational systems. No ideas about automatic recognition as such, which in a way is trying to make the system more harmonized in a sense. At least that's how I decode discussions taking place in Europe. This is about respecting diversity. This is about respecting the various education systems and making them fit, even though it's difficult, based on the principle of substantial difference. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Stig, for your presentation, and Sjur for getting us started. Excellent stuff. So now we are going to go ahead and move to question and answer. We're going to move to question and answer time, so I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing for a second so we can all see everybody on the screen. We have about 20 minutes or so for question and answer, 25 minutes. And I'm going to start with Omar. Omar, I've got your hand up. Go ahead and kick us off. Omar, I think you're muted.
Sorry, classical mistake. Sorry for that. And thank you, Stig and Sjur, for your excellent presentations. I'm very happy to be here today, and I think I've learned a lot about this UNESCO 2019 Global Convention on Higher Education Qualifications. I have a lot of questions, to be honest, in mind. I think I've jotted down probably 5 questions, but I'll begin with with perhaps the 2 most important ones. And drawing maybe on Stig's last point, I think, Stig, you were talking about what the convention is not. And you mentioned homogenization and harmonization. Well, actually, I'm thinking of homogenization. You actually mentioned harmonizations. I'm wondering whether you could say more, if you may, whether you could say more about some of the criticisms or reservations that have been raised so far in the process of consulting for and drafting the convention, maybe within the UNESCO itself or some other organizations that you've collaborated with or worked with nationally and worldwide. I'd really love to hear more about what, sort of like bringing in the 2 opposite points of view or arguments and counter arguments vis-a-vis the convention. So that would be my first question, and briefly also my second one. I'm thinking about the region where I come from. So I'm from Lebanon, Lebanon or the Arab region more broadly. And I recognize, at least this is what I've distilled from the two presentations, I recognize that, as Stig was saying, yes, the convention is a tool of internationalization, but it can be a positive tool for internationalization, a constructive tool for internationalization. And so building on that, I'm wondering whether the speakers could comment on how, or share their thoughts on how the convention can probably act as an anti-corruption tool, in particular in certain regions of the world. Just to give you an example, really, in 2022, I've got this piece of news in front of me, hundreds of fake Lebanese degrees sold to Iraqis. So there was this tension between Iraq and Lebanon, like the higher education system in Iraq and the higher education system in Lebanon. And apparently the scandal was like hundreds of fake Lebanese higher education degrees sold to Iraqis, including members of parliament, members of the Iraqi parliament. So it might be a long shot, but I'm wondering whether that sort of convention could have certain anti-corruption functions or contributions in that specific area, because it's one of the areas I'm actually interested in. So sorry for taking long, 2 questions, and I'm happy for any of the speakers or both of them to answer them. Thank you, Will.
Thanks, Omar, for your questions. Stig, perhaps for you first, with any critiques that you've seen in the construction or rollout of the Global Convention.
I mean, to put it this way, I mean, if this would have been easy, it wouldn't taken over a decade to be where we are today, and it wouldn't have taken since 1947 to actually agree that let's do this in the international community. I think it has been clear from the start that any attempt from anybody saying that one type of education system or one type of qualifications are superior to others or better than others would naturally not fly in the international context. I mean, there's such a great diversity in higher education, even in Europe, quite a bit. But if you take this into the global landscape, and even to your country, I mean, Lebanon, which have like 3 or 4 even parallel educational systems in a small country, right? In which they wouldn't agree that it's one system. So the fact that you base this on the respect of the systems as they are, and you have to find recognition practices that mediate it as much as possible. But of course, there are qualifications that will not get a yes and recognized step. I mean, if me as a university or recognition body can, let's say, prove and document that this qualification is substantially different to comparable qualifications in my country, it's okay to say no, but I have to explain why I say no, naturally. So I think that was kind of the basis, is that it has to bring in the respect for diversity. I think in the negotiations, it went fairly smooth. It took place when, let's say, the geopolitical climate was less tense than it is today. I mean, I think with situations in with the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, negotiating this tool would have been more difficult. It would have been, everything becomes connected to what we see and what we experience with a war like this. And when one member state of the international community attacks another member state of the international community, and it has so much effect for higher education and students, which is like the scope of the convention. One theme that we didn't really land a very strong text on, and it's also opposition from countries in Europe, was with the aspect of recognition of prior learning, where some countries wanted this very much to be included, and they have practices and history on doing this, while for others this might seem like this is too difficult, we don't even have practices to do it. We have resistance from university that maybe are more, if I may say, traditional in the sense of looking on qualifications. So the text became a little bit weaker on that spot than part of the other text. But I think it's okay. It's mentioned, and it is as far as the global community could agree on. There was also some discussions on refugees. Some countries have challenges with their own national definitions of refugees and legislation on refugees. But I'm very happy that we managed to land a pretty strong text on that. When it comes to anti-corruption, I think I will let Sjur start, because in Europe, I think you've been involved with work that has been covering that field as well. Of course, many other fields with I believe a scheme called ETINED, which is ethical practices in higher education in Europe. So I think I'll let Sjur start, and I might fill in.
So thank you very much, if I may. Before doing that, could I just have one brief comment on the issue of harmonization? I think what has happened in Europe is, in a sense, making it easier, and that's the purpose of the convention also, making it easier to bridge one education system, one degree system to another. I often think of recognition as a bridge spanning, it could be a river, it could be a ravine, and very often you find on the other end of that bridge, you find the customs station if it crosses the national border. So the task of recognition is to make the customs procedures as easy as possible and make sure that you don't have to leave a part of your luggage behind in the form of non-recognition. Now, to do that in Europe, we have developed what we call an overarching qualifications framework for the European higher education area. It doesn't mean that all national qualifications are identical, but it does mean that the overarching framework sort of sets the outer limit within which diversity is possible. I mean, there's nothing to prevent you from developing a national qualifications framework where you need to study 10 years at the university to get your first degree. It just wouldn't be compatible with anything else. It wouldn't do your students any service. So I think the development in Europe, with the development qualifications framework, with the development of quality assurance, doesn't mean we're all the same. We respect each other's identity. The only time that I know about it would use the term harmonization was in the Atelier report, which was sort of one of the reports that preceded the European higher education area. But it does make things easy. It makes it easier to bridge systems. Now, for ethics, I think actually the convention does have an important function as preventing fraud. It clearly rests on the assumption that the qualification for which you apply for recognition is a genuine qualification. Now, how do you check that? Both the Council of Europe with the ETINED platform, Ethics, Transparency and Integrity in Education, and the UNESCO International Institute for Education Policy actually has sort of anti-corruption, pro-transparency programs. But I think also in the ENIC and NERC networks, there is a lot of exchange between recognition professionals on how you can actually identify fraudulent qualifications. Increasing challenge, obviously, now with the development of academic integrity, of artificial intelligence. I'm sure that this is something that the networks will pay a lot of attention to. So I think that the convention is a basis, but if you want to fight corruption, it really needs to be done through practice, and here the networks are essential. So I really hope that the global convention will also be able to draw on a network like this. So I think that's what I would like to say, but I see there is a very interesting question from Alianda Valeta in the chat that I would like to come back to if there's time. So.
Yeah. Thanks so much, both of you, for your insights. Omar, I forgot to ask you to introduce yourself since you're helping to organize this.
Oh, yes.
If you want to say who you are.
Thank you. Well, I'm Dr. Omar Kaisi. I'm based at Moray House of School of Education and Sport, just like my colleague Fatih Aktas, a teaching fellow. And yes, very happy to be here today, and I've contributed to organizing this webinar. And thank you also, Stig and Sjur, for your answers. Thank you.
Excellent. Now I know we've got Alejandra here. So Alejandra, you want to introduce yourself? I don't know if you want to feel free to unmute and go ahead and explain your question a little bit. Okay.
Well, hi. Well, when people call me Alejandra, I feel like I've done something wrong. Everybody calls me Ali. Hi, I'm Ali Berletti, and I'm very happy to be here because I've started studying regional higher education in 2007 in Norway with Åsa Gornicka. I was an Erasmus Mundus student many years ago when I was 2. And I ended up in Norway as well, which was a very important learning for me because it's where I learned everything I could have learned about higher education at the University of Oslo. However, what you have been talking today seems that in this 15 years that I have been working on this, things continue to follow a very interesting pattern. For instance, the EU leading the way, having a supranational condition and funding and support and structure to make a regional agreement to be legally binding, whereas all the rest of us cannot do it. And I say rest of us because I'm from Brazil. And I think that this is very interesting, but my question would be about how did that transition happen? And that's the first question that I posted in the chat. From a Lisbon Convention, which we know that works differently in terms of governance, funding, people, conditions, capacity building, everything, and extending to a global project, which might as well take another 8 years to happen, 73 years to happen. And so I wondered if you can please talk about that a little bit.
Should I start on this one maybe? And so thank you very much, Ali. And
thank you.
I'm happy to see that you graduated from at least part of your study with my alma mater. I know Åsa Gornicka well. She's currently the vice rector of the University of Oslo. Now, I don't think the Lisbon Recognition Convention as such ever stopped being a European project. It is very much a European project. And it is, as I said, the only legally binding treaty in the European higher education area. And so there was no intention, certainly not from the Council of Europe side, to make the Lisbon Recognition Convention global. As I said, there was a discussion in UNESCO almost in parallel that concluded that the time for a global convention is not right. I think what UNESCO then did, if I understand correctly, was look at the Lisbon Recognition Convention, see whether that could be drawn on in reviewing the other regional convention, because there was a feeling that the previous generation of regional conventions were ripe for retirement. And I think out of that, but that's Stig, Arne would know better, came the idea of maybe if we revise all the regional conventions, and there are discussions that go in the same direction, maybe there is scope for a global convention. Can I just comment one other thing in what you said? Now, I would not want to underplay the role of the European Union. It is very clearly plays a key role in Europe. It has supported the European higher education area and continues to do so. However, the EU has a subsidiarity principle for education, which devolves responsibility to the member states. And I think it's actually interesting to see that the only legally binding treaty in the European higher education area comes not from the EU, but from the Council of Europe and UNESCO. And that is because we were able to develop something that was pan-European and that shined with member states. Thank you.
Of course, I apologize. I apologize for making the equivalence, Council of Europe and the EU. I really apologize. You're very right. So thank you for that. Thank you for that.
Worry.
Norway. What did Norway do well in that? Oh, sorry.
Thank you. So just a comment. I think the Lisbon Recognition Convention, and I know, I'm certain that the Lisbon Recognition Convention is something that in a way we take it for granted today because it's there, but it has really successfully been a strong element that has contributed to the more or less seamless mobility we see in Europe today. System is far from perfect, but it's more or less working well. And an important basis for that is the work in the Lisbon Recognition Convention and the cooperation between the member states, but also the establishment of these networks. It's called like the Enigmatic network, which kind of works mostly with sharing of good practice and sharing information and building information provisions to facilitate and to make this easier, to make it less difficult, both for the students, but also for the universities, for employers, and for society within the European continent. And I think the success inspired other regions. Of course, UNESCO was pushing for it, but UNESCO would not have succeeded unless the member states said, okay, let's do this, let's try this. We believe this can work. And it has to work on their own premises. I mean, many of these negotiation processes in the regions, or most of them, took several years before they agreed upon a text, which needed to build in the various specificities of national policies in Africa, in Asia Pacific, in the Arab world, in Latin America and the Caribbean, and so on. So they are not identical, but they have more or less the same build-up, but with some differences. Two things are important with the Global Convention in relation to this, is that in principle, the Lisbon Recognition Convention and the other regional conventions are only applicable within your own region. I think Norway and UK, we apply it to all. We apply it globally, but in principle, it only applies for qualifications within your own region. So then it's important also to know that of the approximately 6 million international students we have today, more than half of those, more than 3 million students, are studying outside their own continent or region, one can say. And in principle, there was no legal tool covering that. So taking that into consideration, the coverage potentially for international students have doubled, and eventually, when more and more countries will ratify this, will become more and more complete with regards to having access to fair, non-discriminatory practices of recognition, which will ease mobility.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I think that for me it's just the clarifications of that the Global Convention sees the interregional mobility as a key aspect for internationalization as well, whereas it might be considered as a global, not tool, but a global pass, as a global recognition rather than regional. So I think that this wasn't very clear to me, but now you have clarified, and I really appreciate it.
I would perhaps like to add two elements. The first is that, to me, a convention has two functions. It is a legal instrument, and as such, as Stig Arne very rightly said, it is binding on the states that ratified it, the parties to the convention. But it is also, and this element should not be underestimated, it really is a good guide to good practice. And as such, it's open to any university, any country that would like to use this good practice. I mean, both from the Council of Europe and UNESCO's side, we've argued, I would say almost since the convention was adopted, that it would be incoherent for European countries to say, I'm a party to the Lisbon Convention, therefore, I look at substantial differences when I look at a qualification from another country that's a party to the Lisbon Recognition Convention. But if I have a qualification from another region, I use the time for time principle, or I try to be as strict as possible. That's totally incoherent, and that's not the way that Europe would like other countries to look at our qualification. I think one of the things that the Global Convention has done is to bring the good practice and the sort of legal dimension together. Now, you asked about a role in Norway. I think it illustrates also how important a national center is. In 1997, the Norwegian clinic was located at a university. It was a decent center, but it was not really at the forefront of development, didn't play that much role in the discussion around the Lisbon Recognition Convention. I think what happened is Norway moved its center into a national center, but then they also got Stig Arne, so persons also make a difference. I think without Stig Arne's work, Norway would not have had the key role that it has played in the global convention discussion.
And I also remember that Norway was the very first country to even implement the Bologna process. I remember that it was
I think it would be a long discussion. I'm not sure we have time for that now. It's done reasonably well, but it's certainly not the only one.
I learned that in Oslo. Well, thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you both for your answers. Fatih, I see you've got your hand up. Go ahead and come on in.
Thank you very much, Stig and Sjur. Great to have you today. Thanks for accepting our invitation. I just want to ask a quick question about quality assurance mechanisms. Like, can you talk about some of the practices, like whether quality assurance mechanism is mandatory or voluntary, like by each state? Like, let's say if there is a country lacking quality assurance mechanism, what's the approach that they need to take? Maybe if you can provide a bit more details about that, this would be very helpful. Thank you.
The short answer, if they don't have quality assurance provisions, they should get one as soon as possible. Now, in the European arena, I said in 1997, when the Lisbon Recognition Convention was adopted, there was a discussion about whether you needed formal quality assurance or not. 5 years later, the discussion was about how, and a few years after that, in other words, in 2005, in the context of the European higher education area, that question was answered by the adoption of the European standards and guidelines for quality assurance in higher education, which were reviewed in 2015. So I would argue that in Europe, certainly in the European higher education area, quality assurance is A, not optional, and B, there are guidelines for how you're going to do it. And we hope this will also make European higher education qualifications more credible in other parts of the world. But Stig Arne would be a better place to talk about how this plays out at the global level.
Yeah, it's a little bit more complex on the global level, and also a bit more controversial on the global level. But it's an important aspect, but it also has to take the various, let's say, regional traditions and regional policies on this into consideration. And it's important to know that this is a global convention, and it has to really encompass all types of ways on looking at higher education. More and more countries globally are having what we can say is more traditional quality assurance, normally operationalized through a quality assurance agency, or some even have more than one. So we see that as a trend, but there's also some countries which are still in opposition to that, and that needs to be respected as well. How can you then recognize qualifications if there are no quality assurance system in place as we see it from the European perspective? What one can argue is that, of course, it's up to the member state to define their own higher education systems and which institutions belongs to them and what are the requirements that they need to meet. But in principle, it is the authority in the member state which defines what the system looks like. And normally, when it comes to recognition, one would look at a qualification and first see, is this part of their higher education system or not? That is normally one of the things that you tick off before you go into the list in which Sjur presented earlier. But there is no, it doesn't have to have a qualification, it doesn't have to have a quality assurance system in order for it to be recognized. And that's still the practice in Norway and UK and many other countries today. But with that said, personally, what I hope and what Norway will try to bring into the discussion on the global convention is to maybe see if there is a possibility to develop some sort of subsidiary text on this issue. Calling it quality assurance might be difficult because it's still like a red flag for particularly certain countries in Latin America, but also some countries in other regions. But something that will at least define what is quality and what indirectly a definition of what is higher education. I think that would be important because this is the first UN treaty in higher education. UNESCO has the sole mandate in higher education in the UN system. But we'll see. We'll see how far one can get on this. I think it will be easier to negotiate such a text possibly when there are 20, 25 member states sitting around the table than in 10 years when we have maybe 70, 80 member states around the table. But let's see. This is one of the things that Norway will try to bring to the table when we will be negotiating the work plan.
And if I could just add to that, I think, no, I'm retired, so I can be politically less correct. But I think if I were the competent authority, the public authority of a country that does not have a quality assurance system, I think I would be concerned because if you don't define your qualifications, if you don't define your quality assurance arrangements, others will do it for you. And in the European context, we have the concept of national qualifications framework. They're self-certified. In other words, the competent authority of this education system write a report in which there should be participation by 2 foreign experts, saying why their qualifications framework is compatible with the overarching framework. Now, nobody can challenge that report in the sense of saying you have to redo it, but they can say, yes, this looks credible. Or they can say, well, we don't really think this is very credible, so we'll not take that report fully into account when we recognize qualifications. So what Stig Arne said, the exchange of information, the building of trust is really an essential part of the machinery that makes conventions work in practice.
Excellent. Thank you both for your responses there. I know we're running out of time here, so appreciate everybody able to hang around for a couple minutes over. I think from somebody who's not necessarily a higher education person, especially that clarification on Lisbon versus the global recognition, how the two conventions might work together or might actually complement each other. It was quite interesting for me today. So thank you so much for that. All right, as we're wrapping up today, I do want to make sure I'm thanking some key people, obviously starting with Stig Arne and Sjur. So Stig Arne, I saw your hand pop up. You want to jump on in briefly?
Yeah, I just want to give kind of one more comment that we had in Europe actually regarding the global convention, because some member states initially said, yeah, might sound like a good idea, but we don't need it. We apply the same principles of the Lisbon Recognition Convention for all qualifications. But they started changing their mind when they realized that by not supporting a global convention, they are weakening the value of their own qualifications, because when there is no global system on how qualifications will be recognized, then a German qualification or a Bulgarian qualification or a Norwegian qualification is much less worth in Costa Rica, in Argentina, in Colombia, in Guinea, and so on. So it's a matter of also taking care of your own national qualifications and securing your own quality, that this is important. And I think that argument took a bit of a while to develop, but it took down quite rapidly the resistance certain strong member states in Europe had in the preliminary discussions of the negotiations of the global convention. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much for that. All right, so as we close here, I want to obviously thank our presenters and panelists today, so Stig Arne and Sjur, for joining us and helping us understand a little bit more about conventions, qualifications, and how this new global convention is happening. and being ratified and out in force now. So appreciate that. I also want to thank Fatih Akhtas and Omar Kazi for organizing the event on behalf of the CID Research Group and the Higher Education Research Group here at the University of Edinburgh. I've got the link to the Global Convention obviously in the chat, but it's also here on the screen. If you want to know more about the new Global Convention, please do that. And a reminder that today's recording will be posted online. We'll also send out an email to those that have registered today, letting them know that it's available. So thank you all very much for joining today, and we're going to stop the recording now and hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. So Fatih, I'm going to leave it to you to stop the recording.